Start recording. Fantastic. All right. Thank you, folks, for joining us here on this Friday afternoon. Huge turnout for Friday afternoon. Absolutely. Well done. This is our final Honors College Colloquium of the spring semester, and we're very happy to be joined by one of our newer colleagues, Dr. Hannah Jones, see here to my left. And she's an assistant professor of history here at the university, and she's going to be speaking to us today, as you can see by the screen, on property, piety, and prayer, the four Clares of Zadar in 14th-century notarial records. Get after it.
Thank you, Craig.
No worries.
So this is a conference presentation that I have coming up in about a month. So I'm still working through my argument. I want to make that clear off the top. I'm working through a really large collection of documents that I have been painstakingly trying to transcribe. So you'll see an image of what I've been dealing with, and hopefully that makes you a little bit sympathetic as my audience. But overall, I think the ideas are all there. I'm just trying to figure out, basically if there are other ways to interpret the evidence. I have my ideas about Venetian influence in Zadar, but I think there's still work to be done, and I'll talk about that in my conclusion. So the other thing, another disclaimer, typically at a medieval conference, there's no text on the slides. There's a lot of art history snobs in the medieval world who prefer just images. So sticking true to that model, there will be no text on my slides, actually. So this is very much an oral presentation experience. So as the slide mentions, we're talking about Zadar, so we're looking at the Croatian coast, and this area was typically under control of the Venetians, particularly up until the Treaty of Zadar is signed in the late 14th century. And that treaty is actually signed at the Franciscan church there. So just a little bit of foreshadowing of how important these ladies are to the local community. And this is an image from the gate outside of Zadar. It's still standing. You can see the Venetian line there. And there's really a lot of Venetian iconography in the whole old town. If you're walking through Zadar, it's just a really beautifully preserved area. So all of the images in the slides will be coming from my research that I did there.
Click on the screen.
Oh, okay. All right. So before we get into Zadar, I want to tell you just a little bit about my topic, kind of set up the stakes of my argument, and tell you about the four Clares, or the followers of St. Clare of Assisi, who you can see on the slides here. So this is her community, San Damiano in Italy, right outside of Assisi. You can tell it's kind of separated from the actual community, which is traditional for Clarissan communities in particular. They would often be located right outside of the city walls. But by the 14th century, that pattern has pretty much evolved into them being right in the middle of the city, right in the mix of everything. And I think that points to how they gradually took on more civic importance as our order was allowed to own property. So this is a lot of background context that you don't necessarily need to understand my argument, but I thought it might be helpful to know about before we get into things. So Clare was a follower of St. Francis of Assisi. She died in 1253. And this is an image of her. Is the famous Clarissan altar that's commissioned shortly after her death, and you can see scenes from her life going around it. So, what are we talking about today? Well, it's really uncommon for historians to think about the Poor Clares as having a lot of civic agency. This is because they take vows of enclosure, so the community that they're a part of, as I mentioned, typically it was seen as in the margins of society. And the women, they take these specific vows that prevent them from leaving the monastic space. So people can come visit and speak to them through the grates. They can petition for prayers, but the women themselves aren't visible physically in the day-to-day interactions and financial transactions of the city. They're more so behind the scenes, and their church in particular becomes a site for notarial transactions. So wills, donating property, obviously, but also marriage contracts, all sorts of contracts, are in the records. So they're really, really involved, but this isn't a place for female agency that historians typically have been looking. So I'm kind of opening up this new area of research with the treasure trove of documents that were available in the State Archive of Zadar. So I'm trying to demonstrate how these enclosed women were really prominent actors in the 14th century Adriatic, particularly as extensions of their Venetian families. So I'll get into that context. But the kind of starting point of my research was just sort of wondering, how did the poor Clares of St. Nicholas and Zadar wield power, and how did that power generate both authority and also vulnerability, right? Because they've taken these cells of enclosure, even though they're going to build up wealth, they're going to build up influence, they don't necessarily have a direct way to defend themselves. So they're not, they don't have weapons in their treasury. They have spiritual weapons, relics, rain maybe, but they're very vulnerable because of the status that they take on throughout the 14th century. So yeah, this taps into a trend of kind of reconsidering how property ownership worked in a monastic context for women. So even though they're not going out, they are still overseeing a lot of economic transactions that feed into the broader, I would say, community. So there's also been a lot of work on urban monasticism and economic activity, but particularly just focusing on the Franciscans themselves as actors in that context. So there's lots of studies on the Franciscans serving as landlords, the Franciscans serving as creditors, and then just generally being very involved in the diplomatic affairs of city life. But because the women have taken these vows, they haven't really been imagined as having much sway in those arenas. They're more so contained to the private sphere. But what people fail to remember is that the Franciscans would be the intermediaries. So they would be coming and going from those Clarisan spaces, and they would be acting as an extension of the Clarisan agency. So it's mediated, but it's still definitely a way that we can see the women claiming power for themselves. So they're not the ones who are doing the economic transactions directly. It would be a friar acting as that in between. But nevertheless, the people are going to their site, right? The people are traveling to them. They're making the donations to them. They're selling a property to them. And it's ultimately the women who have the deeds to the property. So the landlords aren't actually the Franciscans, it's the Clares. So that's not been very obvious in the historical record. It takes a bit of digging to see their names and to kind of see the way in which they're influencing things passively, I would say. And then the other element of this is kind of a colonial aspect. And this is the idea, the theory that I'm really workshopping and trying to nail down at this stage of my research. So when you look at the notarial records for the poor Clares, particularly in Croatia, they all come from a Venetian heritage. So this is very unique in the sense that the main people living in Zadar and living in the Croatian coast were native Croats, right? Or they at least had that heritage. Ooh, someone else is here. Lovely. So they have that Venetian heritage, but they're overseeing transactions for a largely ethnically Croatian population. So that kind of demographic speaks to this larger project that historians call Venetian colonialism. So colonialism obviously is a modern term, but when you think about the mechanics of having a colonial state, the way that you would have a hub that would extract resources that would go back to like the main state, that's very much the case of what was going on with Venice in Croatia. So the leaders of Zadar, the governors, the counts, they would all have a Venetian background, and they would be, making policies that directly benefited Venetian interest back in Italy, essentially. So a lot of resentment gets built up about this, culminating in the Treaty of Zadar. And so one of the ways that I've been interpreting both the power that the poor Clares have and also their vulnerability is by thinking through that Venetian connection. And particularly how, even though the Venetians themselves aren't making up a large portion of the community, they're only holding those elite leadership positions, they're coming and going, they're not really establishing residency there. It's the poor Clares who are there. It's the poor Clares who are grounding that influence and that power of the Venetian aristocracy and the merchant class. And not coincidentally, it's the poor Clares who own all of the islands off of Zadar, where the vineyards and the granaries are being set up. So you can see them as having this direct economic involvement in benefiting the Venetian state. So it's an idea I'm workshopping, but I'm definitely standing on solid ground in the sense that lots of work has been done about the Venetians having these colonial interests in Croatia, but no one's really put women into that picture and thought about how nuns who are maintaining those familial identities could be an extension of that as well. So that's really where I'm coming from in kind of the scope of this research today. And the way I've gotten into it is just by digging into a really rich collection of records from the state archive. But I do hope to bring in more evidence to broaden and kind of do more comparative work to see if this pattern holds throughout the coast, going down to what today is Montenegro, but at the time would have been Kotor. So let us now consider how the communities of the port there could function as local hubs of Venetian influence. And then kind of we'll think through the constraints that they face because of their vows. Okay, so here are some lovely images from Zadar. So this is the main church. And you can see Zadar had been part of the Roman world going back, obviously, to the classical period. There's lots of Roman ruins, but there's also a really nicely preserved medieval old town. And so this Romanesque church here it was established in the 11th century, but it was a main church in the 14th century. And you might be asking yourselves, well, where is the monastery of the Poor Clares, Dr. Jones? Well, I would love to show it to you, but it has its own rich history that ties into both World War I and World War II, actually. So the site today is now being used by the archaeological conservation group that's doing oceanic exploration in the area, but it no longer looks at all like it used to, essentially. So it was desecrated in 1798 by the Austrians, who converted it into a military barrack and hospital, and then it continued to serve that purpose in World War I and World War II. So yeah, the International Center for Underwater Archaeology calls it their home today. So I wasn't able to actually get in there, but I wouldn't have seen anything medieval anyway, right? So not a huge loss. But just some background for you on Zadar and why it was so important to the Venetians and just important in the medieval trade of the Mediterranean. So Zadar is the oldest continuously inhabited city in Croatia. It was under Venetian rule formally starting in 1202 with the Crusades, where the Crusaders famously attacked Zadar to get money, payment back, a debt that was owed to the Venetians. So going all the way back to then, the Venetians established their rule, and it was in place until 1358 when the treaty was signed. So this didn't mean mass Venetian settlement. So this is where we get into the colonial demographic aspect of the settlement. The populace was a mix between local Dalmatians, so like a Slavic majority, and notarial records show that constant immigration was happening from nearby Croatian areas, but really not so much from Venice. Instead, the Venetians in Zadar were mostly governors, so like rectors or counts, officials, notaries, merchants, military officers, and so they had a much more liminal status in this community. They weren't really grounded, so they would be coming and going back and forth to Venice pretty regularly. And in this sense, yeah, they weren't a settled group, so they're not really integrated into the existing social networks. They're kind of imposing their own structures on top of it. So yeah, the Venetians are ruling through these elite family networks, essentially. And that brings us to the Poor Clares of St. Nicholas. So as I was saying, when you look at the records, the registers of the nuns, all of the names are Italian. And it's specifically the aristocratic family. So you had to have a large dowry in order to join the Poor Clares. And other historians have talked about this pattern where the families will donate land to the monastic community, basically as a way of sheltering it from being swallowed up by a competing power or competing family. So it's kind of a way of keeping property within the family network, within the family interests, particularly in contested areas. So this pattern makes total sense in Zadar. makes total sense that the women would give them kind of a foothold, and then gradually through papal donations and other donations, they could take on more and more land, and that land would be brought into the economic system of the Venetians. So the other thing I forgot to mention is all of the currency that's circulating in Zadar in this moment are Venetian lira, like are Venetian coins. So all of the property transactions that I see in the records are done in Venetian currency as well. So that's another kind of indicator of how all of their work is benefiting that other state in Italy as much as themselves. So there's a lot of competition, as you can imagine, over land, over properties, rental properties, and over those resources. So grain is particularly contested. Vineyards, there's lots of disputes revolving around different areas where they want to put vineyards, and other people say, no, this should be our vineyard area. And really what this tells you is that the space was limited, but also maybe the locals were kind of finding ways or strategizing ways to keep out those Venetian interests. So that's something I'm entertaining, but I need really more research to make that a solid argument. So then looking forward, what we do know about the monastery of St. Nicholas, it does date back to the 11th century. It was originally constructed for Benedictine nuns. And it was potentially abandoned after the Crusade in 1202. And at that point, the poor Clares weren't even really expanding. They weren't a day in 1202. So it went through this kind of period where maybe there was a very small Benedictine community there, but not large enough to fill up on the records. And then the site comes back into the records officially in the 13th century in 1260. When we have a papal bull that gives them permission to, well, a papal letter that gives them permission to adopt the rule of Pope Urban. So they, at that point, take on this really special legal status within Zadar. And this is, again, part of a broader pattern of the Poor Clares and Franciscans receiving favoritism from the church. So they get papal protections and exemptions, particularly from taxes. So that's one of the main ways that they can build up their own wealth. They don't have to pay in these large tithes. And whereas the other religious communities in Zadar do have to pay papal tithes. So you can imagine that's not going to put a good taste in their mouths, right? They're going to feel resentful about that. So that special status was also echoed by the fact that the Poor Clares, just kind of internationally at this point, and I do mean internationally, they are all over Europe. I mean, they are literally everywhere you can imagine in the West. They, at that point, were being patronized by the royal families as well. So even Louis the Hungarian, who eventually signs the Treaty of Zadar, he's also patronizing Poor Clares. Not in Zadar, not the Venetian houses, but he's establishing his own, perhaps competing houses as a way of grounding his claims as he gets closer and closer to the coast. So they're definitely involved and connected to kind of the biggest power players in the medieval world, right? The papacy, the royal families, and the merchants, the merchants of Venice. The Venetians will love that I'm giving them all of that power and credit. So this is showing you what the site looked like when it became a military hospital and barrack. And you can see it's very close to the Franciscan church. That's very common for Florescent communities, particularly once we get into the 14th century and they're moved inside of the city gates. So yeah, the special status of the Poor Clares, it officially we start to see kind of toward the end of the 13th century. We see a lot of papal letters being written about basically the local church officials not honoring the papal privileges that the Clares have received. So this first comes through with Pope Nicholas IV. He had a very special relationship with the Poor Clares. He had been the protector of their order before he was ever made Pope. So he was already deeply committed and invested in the project. And then once he becomes Pope, he officially frees them from church dues and grants indulgences to anyone in the region who travels to their church. So that's an economic way of building up the donations for the women in this emerging community, essentially. So he's trying to create structures to make sure that they have longevity, that they will be successful. Then Pope Boniface VIII gives them similar privileges. So we're right now at the beginning of the 14th century. He echoes the privileges that had already been issued. And then he also says that they should be exempted at the local level from paying the grain tax, which is interesting because it suggests that maybe they were actually struggling at this point, right? They needed that extra boost to maintain their presence, perhaps. Hard to say. There's just not a lot of records for what was going on at this moment. The records really pick up, though, in the 14th century and at the end of the 13th century over conflicts that start to ensue about these special statuses. So I will get into those in a second. But overall, the records. So this is the archive view. That's the Church of St. Francis. So I thought it was really nice you to see it from the window. And this is right outside the archive. This is the city wall here, the old medieval wall. So the records of the poor Clares. This is the collection that I'm working with. As you can see, it's expansive. The 1202 documents, that's a little misleading. That's just basically documents saying, hey, this site's been abandoned, and then later petitions asking to rebuild and extend onto it. So you can see there's varying degrees of damage to these documents. So some might just have, small, kind of inconsequential, perhaps, tears. But that word was very important, and it might have been. Yes.
You minimize the people there, why I will be able to see that document.
There you go. So you can see holes. So it's kind of the luck of the draw in terms of what is in good condition and what's not. There's literally hundreds of parchment. So the ones that have these stains, that's a seal that would have been remaining. So this was a more official document pertaining to a papal ordinance. But then you get these really long documents like this one that actually contain narratives of the dispute and of the legal proceedings. And those are what I've been in the weeds of. So these short documents are a lot easier. They're also a lot more. There's a formula for papal letters. There's a formula for particular exemptions. Whereas these, it's kind of like each line reveals something new to me in terms of where the case is going. So I'm going to tell you about a particular case and kind of how I've been following it and where I'm at with it now, and then I'll give you some conclusions about what I think it all means and what does it all mean, Basil? Sorry. So notarial records. Besides the really intriguing accounts of attacks, the records suggest that these were really involved women in terms of like local affairs. So they purchased vineyards, granaries, fields, and houses. They leased land. They acted as landlords. And so a lot of these are about kind of rent payments that are due. They also would oversee loan transactions, wills. So someone's traveling to the Holy Land and they want to set up a will before they go. I've seen 2 examples of that. And so it's really this important economic side. But I don't have enough perspective about, the transactions that are going on elsewhere in Zadar to do much in terms of comparative work about how popular they were, right? I feel like that's an obvious question that you would ask when you hear about all of these transactions. So that's work that remains to be done. But the spiritual economy of their monastery, that's more solid ground. So there are lots of instances of donations in exchange for prayer and intercession. So I think this relates to obviously a clear investment in their spiritual power as much as their political influence and economic power. It wasn't just Italians who were going to them for these. That was my first question is it only Venetians who were going there, or do we actually see some local interaction? And that is true. So Christina, wife of Bogdal de Rubio, it sounds Italian, but it's not. The Bogdal is the sign that it's not Italian. She donated 100 ducats for the construction of an altar for the Church of St. Clare in exchange for prayers for her family. Pellegrina the widow of the late Peter, and I am not great at Eastern European pronunciation, but Aktivist, left 7, it was hard to translate that one too, by the way. They left 78 pounds or ducats to buy a breviary from the neighboring city of Sebnik for one of the nuns in the convent, which is intriguing. Not sure what to make of that. And then, as I mentioned, there's also the inclusion of wills in this collection. So Margaret, the wife of Saladin, that is what the text says. I have not been able to determine where that is coming from. But Margaret, the wife of Saladin, the son of the late Cosa de Saladines, bequeathed 10 ducats to the friar of the convent of St. Demetrius, and then additionally donated money to the nuns at the convent of St. Clare, with the obligation that they read a psaltery on the anniversary of her death. So in that case, I was able to see they were giving other donations as well. So it seems like in terms of like the religious landscape of the community, the nuns are deeply integrated into that. So they definitely were seen as like a reliable source of economic security, in the sense that if you did do business with them, right, they have this backing from Venice, essentially. So they have this great stability that they can offer people. And they also had obviously the spiritual backing and the political backing of the papacy. So by the mid 14th century, they seem to have their feet underneath them, and like the community has kind of bought in to the project or to their authority more. But okay, so this is where it gets kind of where I'm getting kind of in, deep waters and don't really quite know how the story unfolds exactly. But going back into that conflict I set up for you at the late 13th century, they're getting all of these papal privileges, and immediately the local community starts to push back. So here's what happens according to the papal correspondences that I've translated so far. The story starts technically with Pope Innocent IV. We're going back to him. So after he gives them the special privileges, some citizens of Zadar, according to the letter, were encouraged by the Prince of Zadar. This is not a Venetian. Encouraged by the Prince of Zadar to attack the monastery of St. Nicholas, and then they broke down the door, they took grain stocks, and then they did other damage. That other damage is elusive. It's very hard to say what that other damage is. It could allude to sexual violence, which often doesn't get into the record, but we know was happening. Abduction, there's various scenarios that could account for the other damage. So he asked for the process, Pope Innocent asked for the process to be open in Ecclesiastes or in the local court, and for them to be punished, essentially. Then it seems as though this did not happen, because 2 years later, he wrote to the Doge of Venice, Ranieri Zen, to use his power to convince the Prince of Zadar to not interfere with the construction of the Poor Clares new monastery. And he says specifically, tell the Prince of Zadar that the papacy is providing the funds. So it seems like when this initial attack happened, the property was damaged to some really significant degree, and the women were in the process of trying to rebuild, potentially getting donations from the local populace, thus creating competition for the other orders. And then, maybe being thwarted by like the local officials, like being mired in a dispute over like a boundary for the land, for example, is one way that it could have been prevented. So yeah, that same year, so 1264, Pope Urban also allowed for the sisters to receive up to 200 imperial pounds as compensation for interest, extortion, and other crimes. So he's trying to give them financial backing to move forward with their project, and also create a precedent that you shouldn't be attacking this house. You should not be attacking them. Then 10 years later, Ivan, the deacon of St. Nicholas, writes a letter warning the authorities in Zadar not to open a process in favor of some nobles against the poor sisters about possessions. And it's very vague. It says about possessions. Because he says that this issue belongs in ecclesiastical court. Okay. So now we were hearing that it's not just the Prince of Zadar, it's these local families, these noble families that are getting involved and trying to keep the women from expanding and rebuilding. So by 1307, the conflict reaches a new climax. Specifically, a legate writes to Pope Clement V and tries to intercede so that the poor Clares of Zadar and related property could be returned to them. So again, no evidence for when it was exactly taken, but it seems like whatever conflict started back with innocent was still ongoing by the time we're in the early 14th century, right? They're still mired in this dispute about their rightful property and about where their monastery can actually be rebuilt at. And it says, it's very clear, the Latin's very clear that it's forcibly taken away by the prince. So it's a dispute with the highest level of the Zadar government that's outside of the Venetian hierarchy, right? So 1332, we get another instance where we see perhaps this conflict continuing. Arnaldo, the cardinal deacon, writes to say that the nuns are allowed to bury up to 12 noble women in clerical clothes in their church. So this suggests that their property, their church, their cemetery had not been restored to them yet, right? But they're still trying to receive donations for doing the prayers and the ceremonies for the burials. So they're basically renting out somebody else's lots. Like, yes, we can do it. You want us to be the ones that pray for your family every day? Yes, but we can't bury them in our place. We're going to bury them over here, and they're going to allow us to do that. So it's, it definitely suggests that they were still facing a lot of controversy regarding their property rights. 1331, there's litigation over stored grain that appears. 1331, we also see a refute that goes to court over the will of the late Nicola Tidgig. I'm not good at the Eastern names, but this is a will dispute where the Benedictines are actually saying, no, you're not the rightful ones to have this will. This is our property. So the inheritance dispute continues until 1333, and that's where I'm at currently with the documents. It just seems to be going back and forth in terms of like saying, no, his wife came to us on this day and gave us this. And then the other side will say, well, his son said that it was donated to us. So it's very unclear exactly who this individual is. I'd like to do more research into who Nicola himself was to see if he was a prominent figure in the community. I think there's maybe a record there. But my key point here is that the power of the Poor Clares, while it gave them agency, it also made them really vulnerable, right? They're really dependent on ecclesiastical powers to enforce their privileges, to enforce the protection of their monastery. And when you're dealing with the papacy and the Venetians, who are literally nowhere near you, they're in Italy. What happens when an angry mob shows up at your door and demands all of your grain that they feel you've been stealing or getting unduly through your exemptions, right? So it puts them in this very precarious position that we haven't really thought about enough as historians, I would argue. So they're targeted precisely because of their success, and that generates local resentment. So that's our preliminary argument here. And this becomes a way, attacking the sisters, taking the sisters to court, disputing them becomes a way to project frustration toward the Venetian occupation without directly challenging their rule, right? What's the time?
That's how long you want to talk.
Okay, well, I think I'm almost done. So, in conclusion, my central argument: the Poor Clares of Zadar exercised I'll leave it here. The Poor Clares of Zadar exercised real power through property, credit, and spiritual authority, but that power was constrained by their vows of enclosure. Their Venetian identity made them influential, but it might also have contributed to their contested expansion and the attacks on their property. So they had economic power, but they didn't have the coercive power to back it, right? They didn't have any real military force to support the status that they were building up for themselves. And so authority had to be mediated through their spiritual legitimacy and through their papal protections. they didn't necessarily have any recourse themselves to protect their property rights. So they were structural outsiders despite the fact that they were intermediaries for the community. So in terms of broader implications, I think that the case study of Zadar is really important for rethinking women's agency and enclosure, but also just rethinking Venetian influence in Croatia. I'd like to keep this study going and kind of go down the coast and see, do other Port Clare communities face the same challenges in terms of acquiring property and then facing violence from the community as they expand. The monastery could be viewed as a repository for Venetian family wealth. And I think that really does align with the broader argument of Venetian colonialism in this period. So the Port Clares could be viewed as inadvertent or potentially strategic colonial agents within Zadar, controlling land and property. And I haven't been able to find any of the devotional texts that they would have been interacting with, but I think that would give me a better sense of what they thought they were doing and their own kind of understanding of their role within the community. So future directions, I want to map out their property acquisition. I want to use some digital mapping tools to see if their property is in any kind of strategic area that would make it more likely to be contested. So when I was going through the documents, this is a much later detailed map showing the forests that they own. They also controlled like bridges or tolls. Anyway, so this is much later, but I do imagine myself mapping this so I can think through how they would actually be benefiting Venetian control in the Mediterranean physically, if there was some overlap between the Venetian trade and the properties that they were getting. And then additionally, I think it's important to compare this case to other examples. So my broader work has been dealing with mapping all of the Clares and houses that were attacked between the 13th and 14th centuries. So this started specifically through my research on the Port Clares and the Crusades, but I've been able to really unearth a pattern that hadn't been seen or noticed by historians previously. So in all of these cases, these are all contested areas of property, where you could say that the aristocratic families were using the Port Clares to kind of ground their influence within the local communities during a time that their rule wasn't just naturally accepted. So that's my working thesis. Zadar's the first instance I've seen though where grain is actually taken. Grain seems to be a main part of the dispute here. That's not really the case in Italy. Okay, so that's the talk. Thank you all.
We're gonna do you.
Yeah, this is Fort Clare defending her monastery. So this theme of the women facing attacks starts from the very beginning of her cult, and is inherited by her followers, who literally face attacks for various reasons.
Okay, so we have some time for, I have many, but I will defer once
I hope I can
to the
answer.
audience. So does anyone have a question? Anyone? Oh, Dr. Simon.
Hi.
Right.
I love this feminist post-colonial aspect. It's so modern to me. Like, I know because I'm a 20th century historian, that's probably not appealing to you because you're the but for me, I'm like, oh, that's so cool. I have a bunch of questions, but I'm not gonna ask all of them.
Okay.
How many Venetians are living there? You know?
It's a very small percentage. So
I couldn't just be serving the Venetians.
that was my theory at first,
Yeah.
but then I started seeing these like Eastern names.
Yeah.
And so then I was like, no, it can't just be
Yeah.
that they're only serving the Venetians, because they're getting land that they're in the wills of locals, right? But the locals are paying patronage to them amongst like all the other houses.
Yeah, so it's almost like another like nobility instead
Mhm.
of necessarily just religious.
Yeah,
Interesting.
yeah, it does seem class related, definitely.
How long does it take for them to get back and forth between here and?
Not really, not long enough. I mean, just sail across the Adriatic.
Yeah.
In fact, the Crusaders, like that was always the best route for them to get, and they always would just march the very long way, like through Constantinople. I don't know the exact
No, but they can like go back and forth.
Not
basically.
quickly, yeah, pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, I'll ask one last one, even though more. How many floor Clares were there?
Oh, that's a great question. So it seems like there was around 40 at the height, right?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so typically like maybe like 30. So I've been looking for more registers of like the names because I think that's really where a lot of my inquiry needs to go next is like actually tracking these family names.
Yeah.
And kind of seeing like where I can find like fingers in the pot of other
Yes.
saying.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so that's what I want to do. One way that I've done this, I was able to see that one of the sisters living in this house, her father signed the Treaty of Zadar. Like he was one of the witnesses at the Treaty of Zadar that comes up in the record. So like there's a direct family connection to one of like the biggest political ruptures.
Definitely understand the violence, even so you might be like, why are they committing sexual violence against us? But like if you're viewing them as colonizers, then it's a different story.
Yeah, and that was when it kind of clicked for me, was when I started thinking about it in those modern terms. But I think also there is this real pattern of like really prominent women being abducted and forced into marriage as well. So that could be maybe something, I don't know. I'm totally speculating there. But that definitely was happening in Italy. Famously, Dante talks about it in the Paradiso. So it's something I'm entertaining, and I just think if I could do more in terms of like these family connections. I've seen a lot of cool digital history projects that actually show the mapping of those social networks. So I could imagine doing something like that, like trying to map out and see how many removed, people they are from the Doge of Venice. Like
that's so important to understand. I'd be resentful against these people.
I feel like it's a second book project. Like I want to make the dissertation a book first, but then I feel like the rest of my career I could be spent going down these rabbit holes. The Venetians in Zadar and Split and Dominovric.
Awesome job. I'll let someone else talk.
Thank you, Laura.
After you, Michael.
Okay, you want to go first? No. I am also fascinated with the colonial aspect to it. It compares to Composiciones de Guerras, which started in the 1590s, in which we started a whole damn century of litigation between natives there and Spaniards who wanted to get legal title. But the question I have is trying to follow the money here. Who is doing the administrating of these grain farms and vineyards? And who's doing the working?
The friars, and then they also have workers that they pay, like that they. So some of the land that they own is leased, and then some of the land that they own, like the friars work, and then I don't think they have serfs under their control.
Do they all?
They have domestic land.
Because are they? I'm assuming the friars are not working the fields themselves.
That's fair.
So they are.
That's fair.
They do kind of have.
Yeah, they do. Yeah, that's a great point that I hadn't thought about.
And so then if they have peasants, right, and they are farming, and but then they're not getting, in let's say a time of dearth, their fair share of the grain.
Yeah, that actually is such a good point.
And so you have this kind of also, this is a pattern in colonial Latin America too, when indigenous people are producing the food, but the estancieros or hacendados are they think hoarding it. They attack these grain routes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
no, there's an example in the records that I didn't bring up because it's just so weird, but now it kind of maybe would make more sense. Like thinking about, there's this instance where they're arguing about grazing land, and then all of the livestock of the women is killed, apparently. And so the Pope is like, you have to pay for this. Like this has to go to court. But the court system, like the Princess Zadar doesn't want to actually do anything.
Okay, got another question real quick. Grazing lands. Are they private property or like
the Clares
farming land?
That's the thing. The Clares say it's theirs.
Okay.
The Clares say it's donated to
the local
because a lot of
state.
times outside of the towns, right, the common lands Spanish to the ejidos. And then that'd be very much, hey, you're causing it with all your livestock, and I will kill your livestock so mine can have space. Something like that.
Yeah.
There's also, and actually that happens in medieval Spain even too.
Yeah.
Are they all living in the same like place together? Like the friars, the
Yeah,
the
it's a-
nuns.
So the
What about the
friars,
slaves?
the friars are like a block away,
Uh-huh.
basically, and that's very common. But there would be friars that did live in the community with them as well. That would do their confession, and like it's usually 2 friars that would be within the community. But definitely they had domestic slaves, and I have not been able. I haven't looked into the specifics of that, but I should. In Spain, I've looked into it. In the Valencia house in Spain, the domestic slaves appear in the register. And they're definitely Muslim women who have been forced to convert.
So
Yeah.
All right, any other questions before I ask a couple of mine?
someone please, we can't have them.
So, could you go back to the map?
Yes.
Thanks. I was just curious about something there. I have a couple of questions that are just sort of general based on my ignorance of core players. You mentioned the difficulty of getting voices from the players themselves. Do any of your houses produce chronicles of their time? I mean,
They have the first big one, the history of the Four Clares is formally written by a friar in Italy in the 15th century.
So they don't produce their own.
They don't produce, but they do have chronicles in their libraries. The libraries are best detailed in Italy. And at least in like a few houses, I found that they have crusading chronicles in their possession. So the specific ones that talk about them and their martyrs. So they are aware of their place in like the order's history.
Yeah.
But yeah, they don't have like a Franciscan history as it written for them until later.
One other question is: do you see evidence of pushback against this favoring of the Clares and Franciscans at the papal court?
Mhm.
Are there efforts by the Benedictines and the Carthusians, I don't care, the Cistercians and others? Like, is there evidence of them having their own kind of lobbying at the papal court, being like, "Hey, why are you giving them special privileges?"
No, but that's something I should look into. I mean, I've been very focused in terms of my dissertation research about the families that work with the papacy and kind of so the records I've been looking at are generally very positive about the Franciscans. But certainly that changes to different popes, right? Like not all popes are friends of the Franciscans, but it does seem like throughout the 14th century that all of the royal families are using the Franciscans in particular as part of their mission, like their expansion of Christendom and like being good Christian rulers. Like they kind of are the engine of that, it seems. But that could be my own favoritism showing toward the Franciscans. You know, I think earlier it was the Cistercians who were doing that role, but it definitely seems like by the 13th century the Franciscans have taken it over.
Okay, and one last question. Without the dates on this map, I don't know entirely. Like, are these houses being attacked during general periods of instability and violence in the area?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So over here, these houses in Italy are during the Wars of Frederick.
I feel like so much less sorry for them now that I have this whole new training. I really I was like, who's attacking these nuns? You're
So, but in other cases, like this would have been also a crusading context. This is a crusading frontier. So these women aren't being attacked for their reign per se, but they are literally holding the titles for the communities around them. Like they literally own the towns that are being established here by the Piast.
Wait, sorry, that's
It's like colonial. So Michael, you can tell the spots that they're appearing here, like this one in particular, is when they're trying to push this border down. When they're trying
So
when
was that actually?
this is 14th century.
Croatian path.
And in here, this part, so my book chapter deals with this part, but this is during the Black Prince's raids. So the English are, but what's fascinating there is the Plantagenets have patronized and established their own Clarendon houses here. None of those are attacked. Only the Clarendons down here who are linked to the papacy.
So the colonization argument is broader than what's happening in Zadar.
I think so.
The four players are often being used as agents of colonization. Because in southern France, the Capetians are basically foreigners.
Yes.
I mean, the LGBTs.
Yeah. And Edward III has like this really great breviary where he's taking Franciscan saints and putting them next to English saints. And then this is I'm doing a conference in St. Louis, the Renaissance conference. Yeah. So at that conference, I'll be talking about that side of it, where you literally get this weird Crusader history that says a Clarissant nun who was killed in Acre, her body, her headless body, was taken back to England, and Edward came to the funeral to pay his respects for that martyred abbess. And then she's put in the in a different manuscript. She's put next to this virgin martyr, Osith, who was beheaded in England. So there's like this kind of, they're making a sacred landscape kind of by embedding these holy women and saying, look, we're really religious, like we're patronizing these orders. And so you should trust us. And then also let them run the toll road. We're gonna donate the bridge to them and all of the rental houses around. Another fascinating thing. So here in Majorca. Yeah, in Majorca, there's this Anne Gerbs and this other historian who I've been in talks with. They actually found an instance where the court players there start intentionally buying up all of the houses around them, so that they're pushing out the Jews from that area, basically. Yeah. But Franciscan ideology is all about them as having this, greater mission of like forming God's kingdom on earth. So yeah, they're very exclusionary, but they're also very intentional.
Well, I mean, the intentions is really interesting when you're talking about agency as one of your central arguments. How aware are they of their own role as agents of this?
Yeah, well, that's why I want to see what specific properties they're getting. Are they getting properties that strictly benefit the Venetians? Because they're buying a lot of islands that are off the coast here. But maybe not. Maybe there's something else happening that I can't really see yet until I put it all together.
Yeah, there's also similar happening in Sevilla. But you have the Barrio de Santa Cruz, they're buying out the houses, and then they're throwing the Jews and the Gypsies on their side of the river to Tirana.
Mm-hmm.
But I forget who's buying it out. I wonder.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions from folk who may not be nerdy? All right, we can take time about this. We probably have time for one more question before I release you all.
Is that a question, Keegan?
No, I was doing.
Oh, okay. Just kidding.
Any last question?
I'll reserve my more of a comment.
No, you got it. I mean, she asked him the full conference experience. You can.
Yes.
You can ask him on that.
Yeah, because you're gonna get a weird political scientist that's like, well, history doesn't start until after 1648. But
Black.
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
It's poli sci start.
The behavioral revolution.
What's your question, comment?
No, but I thought it was super interesting because all this sounds so modern. As soon as you start kind of thinking of them as a proxy for prior to the state, they're literally just a proxy of soft power.
Yeah.
We're like, hey, we're unassuming, right?
And they're women.
When we're unassuming, they're kind of collecting all the stuff, but you can kind of do that in a way that it builds up resentment over time. Whereas you come in with force immediately,
Mm-hmm.
that's an immediate threat.
Mhm.
Whereas, like, you're seeing this actually occur during times of hardship or frustration. It's not that dissimilar from like, hey, we're pissed off at the U.S., so we're going to attack their embassy or U.S. branded things, right?
Yeah.
I don't know. I just found that fascinating. It was like, this sounds so modern. I'm like,
The big revolution where actually like the Hungarians and the locals all kind of band together to push out the Venetians happens just I think like 40 years after that huge attack that I was talking about. So it's culminating, right?
Yeah.
And I think that like the frustration's being taken out on the poor players first and foremost, and then it does become militant. And weirdly, the treaty is signed after the Franciscan Church. So I think that that's symbolic, right? Of like their involvement in all of this, and it's witnessed by the friars who were the notaries for the Clares. So
Let's say thank you once again.
thank you,
Ask your
Same hallway up.
Okay, but wait.
Laura, you have to end the recording before you
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, well, question.
Lovely.
Thank you.
In a way.